Hello, this is Dr. Deb Watry giving you a quick review for week 5 for our class. We're into the 5th week. There's only 3 weeks left, so I do encourage you to keep up the good work. In week 5, there are a few things that we're going to be covering. One is that you write your final chapter, which is the methodology chapter, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And another very important item is that filing that IRB form to the IRB committee. And just want you to know, I noticed you last week. This is due November 30th, so you want to make sure that you take care of this. And if you can send it in earlier, that would be beneficial too. So we're going to cover that. Just a reminder that at the end of week 3, you had some resources for Chapter 3. Because in Chapter 3 you talk about the methods that you're going to use in doing your study, and if you haven't done research before, this is very new information. So this was ideas on if you're going to do quantitative or qualitative, a review of all of the methods, and then if you're doing a combination, a review for mixed method research. Some very important readings for this week. Do make sure that you read through, this is the textbook, the Boyd textbook, Chapter 7. It talks about methodology. The Belly resource is the non-experimental quantitative research. It talks about different types. The Creswell, a very important researcher, talks about 5 qualitative approaches to inquiry. And then there's an article posted by Yilmaz on comparing both of them. So these are the required readings that you need to take care of. And I won't pull this slide up, but there also are some supplemental. A big part of Chapter 3 is that you need to provide to your audience an explanation of why you chose the method that you did, and you need to back it up with research. So you might cite the Belly article if you're doing quantitative, from the Creswell article if you select qualitative, or the Yilmaz, or anything from the other supplemental materials. That's a very important part to Chapter 3. And you take about a paragraph or two and explain why your method and your approach fits that quantitative or qualitative or mixed method design. So you do want to make sure you check through these resources because you do want to cite them in Chapter 3. I want to cover IRB, exempt status form, because that is due November 30th. If you click here or click here, that's the form. This is the IRB committee email where you send the form. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, there's 3 areas in particular where you want to pay close attention. As I mentioned last week, they will only meet, the committee meets December 4th, so you have to have your exempt status form into them by November 30th, and as I said before, if you can get it in a day or 2 earlier, the better. Along with that form, it's a PDF fillable form. You have to send in your copy of your city certification, and you have to CC me because this is an assignment worth 5 points, and there's no assignment drop box because you're sending it to the IRB committee. So you want to make sure that you complete each section of the form carefully. There is a mock example that I put out in the course shell. Take a look how that is handled. Because if the IRB committee members feel that you haven't explained your case of why you don't need to do a full IRB, they will have you do a full IRB. So do a good job with this initial form. So at the start of the form, there's just some basic information, your name, contact information, you're a graduate student, here's my name, set a date of when you think you'll be doing the study. If you're going to do it the first part of next semester, I think that's when they run the course next, the 752. You'll probably be starting research collection on the 20th, or you could start even research collection in December if you want to get started and you get IRB approval, and then the finishing date. Do put your title. This is the one that you selected, and that goes there. So the first section asks for a project summary. So you're going to describe what the project will be, about 1 paragraph of the nature of the study while you're studying it. You're going to describe the data that you're going to collect and your data collection instruments. If you're going to use a survey, a checklist, if you're doing a pre and post test, you want to talk about all of your methods of data collection. And then you want to say how you're going to collect that data and protect it. So you actually want to take some time and explain to the IRB committee. There's only a little small section. You have about 4 paragraphs space worth, and that's about it. But you want to tell the IRB committee that you will be protecting the student data. The students will not be putting their names on the data. You're going to keep the data secure and locked up. So take a look at that example. I think I described some of the things that you can do. And then you're going to have 1 paragraph on why your study is exempt, why you do not have to do a full IRB. In the next couple of slides, I'll give you some ideas on that. So when you talk about why your study should be exempt, you want to talk about how your study will create a minimal risk, that your subject will not be harmed, that it won't upset the normal routine of the day class that you're using, that you're not using deception to trick your students or your subjects into lying or presenting information that you're looking for. Another thing of exempt is that you can talk about that this is taking place in the regular classroom using regular instructional strategies. And you can say a sentence about that. And that you're going to be using a commonly accepted educational setting, that it is in the classroom and you're not pulling your students out to do a separate study. The last thing about your exemption area is that you can talk about this is what you're using. A lot of you are just practicing and using different educational techniques or practices, that it is nothing that is out of the ordinary or will negatively impact your students' ability to learn or perform in the class. So do take a look at the sample I gave, but those are some ideas to cover in that exemption areas. The next question asks you to explain your consent process. They want to know how you're going to get parent consent, how you're going to ask student for their assent. Remember, that's 2 different things. If a student is over 11 years old, you also have to do some type of a written 1 or 2, 3 question things that where they will sign their assent also. It can, for students younger than that, it can be in an informal, you might just ask them verbally, but you should have something written out. So you'd go to the IRB, you type UW Superior IRB Committee, and it takes you there. And there's a section that's called Informed Consent Guidelines. And I don't have it all here, but they have about 12 points here of things that you have to think about when you're writing that informed consent. So it talks about how you're going to write the letter to the parents, how you're going to allow students to withdraw. So if you look at the sample that I have out there, I covered maybe about 7 or 8 of the 12 items that were in this list. So you have to create your list, and you want to be convincing here. How are you going to get that consent, and how are you going to protect that student data? And then there's a question that says, do you involve any of these populations below? Well, obviously you're working with children. So then it says if you've selected yes for any of these, you have to talk about your research and what safeguards you'll have in place to minimize that risk. So that's the last place that you write a paragraph. And I'm sorry I don't have a sample here, but it is in the sample form that I put out there for you. The last thing, because right here it says the rest of the thing, this is only a 3-page paper. The last thing the IRB reviewer does is don't forget to do this. You need to put your initials there. Okay, so due November 30th. Again, you're writing a very short description, but a very convincing description. When talking with the IRB committee chair, they're looking forward. I already have sent in a list of your topics, but they're waiting to get your form and your city certification form. So chapter 3, that's the research method. Again, do write out the word 3. Okay, I've been trying to catch you. I've told you in like 3 different PowerPoints now that you have to write out this number for our research purposes. You talk about who your subjects are. You give a little introduction. Always the chapter starts out with an introduction. Who your participants are, what kind of instruments you're going to use, what are your variables, and this would be if you're doing a null hypothesis. How do you collect your data, what kind of analysis procedure, and in this section you want to talk about how are you going to protect that data, and then you do a summary paragraph. This is perhaps the shortest part of your research paper. It will be about 4 or 5 pages long. So let's take a look at that introduction. Like you did in chapter 1 and 2, we start out with a couple of paragraphs, and every chapter in your thesis, you do almost the same thing, but reword it so it doesn't sound monotonous. Talk about your topic, the problem, what was your purpose statement, state your research questions again. So 2 or more paragraphs. And the reason you do this is that somebody could just have your chapter 3. And if you haven't talked about that and introduced it again, and they don't have chapter 1 or 2 or chapter 4 or 5, they won't know what you're dealing with and what you're focusing on. So every chapter in a thesis has this kind of like introduction, and we don't put that word introduction up here. Again, this is one that's in the past tense. You write it as if your research is all finished. Okay, so I'm not going to bring those slides up again, but past tense. So the research covered, instead of covers type of thing. The methodology. This is where you're going to have to cite the Belli article, the Creswell article, or one of the other writers, and or maybe even 2 if you can, of why you've gone with that type of method. So you describe in detail your research methodology. So if you take quantitative, give a couple of sentences of what the quantitative purpose was. If you've done qualitative or mixed methods, same thing. But you have to defend why this was the best approach to take. If you've chosen qualitative, you might want to talk about how you really wanted to get in depth about what students were thinking and feeling, as an example. So this will be about 3 paragraphs. And again, what I'll be looking for in here is that you do cite those resources that are given in your required reading. So some methodology pointers. Here's just a student example from one of the student theses I have out there, how they used the Belli text. It was a quantitative study. So this study used an explanatory quantitative quasi-experimental design, and that's what his article is about. So you can use the same phrase. And this was a quote that she took from his article, quantitative research, blah, 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 blah. Okay, but so she says that her study was explanatory because it aimed to validate the positive cause and effect relationship of physical activity on students' learning and behaviors. So she pulled out this term, explanatory, from this article and then used it to justify why she's using a quantitative quasi-experimental design. So this explanation where you talk about the design and what you're going to do, I just pulled out her first paragraph and then she went on to explain that what she was doing. You describe your participants. Some of you have started doing that already, which is good, in your chapter 1 and so far. So you're going to go in a little bit more detail. Now, if you pull statistics from your school website or the DPI website, you want to make sure that you do give that source for that. Okay, how is this sample representative of a larger population? Maybe you're studying one class and there's 3. Okay, maybe you could generalizable population. It could be generalized to a 3rd grade class in another school, for an example. How do you choose your sample of students? Will it be random selection? Will it be based on parent consent? You want to talk about that. And why this sample size is sufficient for valid results. So when you look at the resources that you read for this week, it'll talk about that you maybe need about at least 10, or you maybe need about half of your class, or whatever it is. You want to make that reference to why the sample size will be sufficient for your results. So this will be 2 or more paragraphs when you're talking about your participants. Remember, your subheadings go in the left margin, and it's just capitalized. We've got to double space the whole thing, okay? The instrument now, 1 to 2 paragraphs. What are you going to use to collect your data? So just don't list them. I'm going to use a survey. I'm going to use a checklist. You want to describe what those instruments are going to be, okay, and how you're going to try to collect the data that you need. So you want to line it up. If you are using a quantitative approach, you do have to describe your variables. Bowie talks about the variables, so you can go back in and read that in his text, and also the Belli article. So you wouldn't have this as you were doing a qualitative. You would need to do it if you're doing a mixed method. This is the longest part, is where you talk about your data collection and analysis procedures. Take a look at the student examples, because you do want to describe in detail How did you collect the data, and how did you analyze? So you want to talk about if you set up charts, or if you did look for averages or the mean, if you compared one group to another. This is how you're going to collect it. So you talk about the process. In the first week, the students did this. In the second week, the checklist was used to watch for this. So you want to take it a step-by-step approach. And then your analysis procedures, even though you don't do this till you get to chapter 4, you talk about how this is what you look for in the data that you collected. So the summary is, I'm going to get back and talk a little bit about data collection in the next slide. The summary is just the major points. Pull it all together, a good paragraph, not 1 or 2 sentences. Give a good paragraph of what you said before. Remember, you're always in a writing. Introduction tells the reader what's coming up. So in that introduction, you talk about these are the parts that you'll find in this chapter. But in the summary, you tell the reader what you told them. This is what some of you are not doing, and I look for it, and I've sent you messages and notes. In every chapter, you have to provide a lead-in to the next chapter. Okay? What's your last sentence of your summary is a lead-in to what will be in chapter 4. So when you're looking at things for data collection, what are the materials? What are your measurement instruments? What's the validity and reliability? Bui talks about that. What's your data procedure that you use? How did you analyze it? This is an important short paragraph. How did you keep your data secure? How did you protect the identification of your students? And so you're already doing something like this when you send in your IRB form. So it might be something very similar that you use then in your own study. Start out when you're doing that data collection section. Let your readers know that you have been given permission to complete your study. So you want to start this before you talk about the students were given a pretest or the checklist was used as the students were doing something. Start out by having a phrase, and this shouldn't be capitalized. Before beginning the data collection, the University of Wisconsin Superior Institutional Review Board, IRB, granted expedited approval of the study. So if your IRB, the expedited form, was approved, you want to use this form. Now you don't know what appendix that's going to be. It's usually the first thing in your appendixes when you list them. So it probably would be Appendix A, and C should not be capitalized. See Appendix A, but you don't know yet. So you know you're going to be putting in appendix for your student surveys when you talk about them, or your parent consent letter. They will get a letter number, but right now you don't know the order, so you can just use the X. Which included approval of the study on the effects of whatever your study is. And then you start out with a pretest. If you're giving a pretest, you're going to direct your reader. Anything that you use in your study has to be in your appendix. Okay, so think about that, your consent letter, your notice of approval, a pre-survey, a checklist. All you need to do for your chapters 1, 2, and 3 is create the consent letter. Okay. That last sentence, these are just 2 student examples. In the following chapter, chapter 4, the results of the study will be discussed. Okay, and the implications and results. The results and implications of the research conducted as a part of this study will be examined in the subsequent chapters. So that last sentence has to lead your reader into what will be in that next chapter. Just some reminders. We're looking for that title page. Update your table of contents as you go through. Page numbering, I've given you a few little notes, and in that APA resource there is a section on page numbering. I'm not going to go back in and go over references again. I talked about that in week 2, 3, and 4 videos, so you can go back and take a look at it. But now take a look at how do you do headers. The title page is a little bit different than the rest of your papers, and this is a resource on how to do that page number and referencing. Coming up in week 6, you cover the ethical stance and validity of your study, you develop your consent letter for parents, and you begin with that revision of chapters 1, 2, and 3, because that's your final project in week 7. So I hope if you have questions, you don't hesitate in asking me. I look forward to helping you as much as I can, and those who have emailed me know that I get back to you as soon as I can. So good luck with writing this chapter. It's fairly new information for you. So I do hope you take that time to study it and think about what you're doing as you design your study.